Good evening, friends, and welcome to Regent College. Whether you're here in person or online, we are thrilled to have you join us for the book launch of Dr. Jonathan Anderson's new book, The Invisibility of Religion in Contemporary Art. My name is Alex Stroschein, and I'm the bookstore manager. As we begin tonight's proceedings, we want to acknowledge that Regent College sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. We kindly ask that if you have any phones or any other devices that might ring, ding, or otherwise beep, that you please put them on silent mode, as we wouldn't like to have any disruptions to tonight's lecture. Jonathan will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we will have about 50 minutes for Q&A. If you are here in the chapel, you can line up at either of the mics at the back of the room and wait to be called upon. If you're attending via the live stream, you can submit a question to questions@regent-college.edu. Following the Q&A, we invite you to join us for a book signing with Jonathan in the bookstore. And please note that the bookstore has Jonathan's new book at an amazing price, $50. Now to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Jonathan Anderson is an artist and theologian, and he completed his PhD at King's College London, and then taught for 3 years at Duke Divinity School as the postdoctoral associate of theology and the visual arts. Jonathan joined the Regent College faculty as the Eugene and Jan Peterson Associate Professor of Theology and the Arts in 2023. He co-authored the book Modern Art and the Life of a Culture, The Religious Impulses of Modernism, which came out in 2016, and he's also written numerous book chapters and articles on related topics. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the publication of The Invisibility of Religion in Contemporary Art, released this year with the University of Notre Dame Press. Lastly, Jonathan is married to Natalie, and they have an adorable son named Isaac. Without further ado, please welcome Jonathan Anderson.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. I'll resist the impulse to gush about how adorable my son is. Good evening. Thanks so much for coming tonight. It's such a pleasure to be sharing this book with you and celebrating its release with you. I spent many years writing this book, so it's a joy to share it with you here. And I should say, I finished this book, I was putting final finishing touches on it about the time I arrived at Regent. You all get a brief thanks in the acknowledgments, but here, another year and a half on, or 2 years, I do want to give a more fulsome thanks to this community for being such wonderful dialogue partners and friends and colleagues and students and so on. So many thanks to you. I should say, this is primarily a book. It's an art history, is really what it is. It's operating in that discipline with a great deal of interest and rigor, more than interest, rigor, hopefully, in theology and religious studies. And this has been such a generative place to do this kind of work. So the book opens with these sentences. The canonical histories of modern and contemporary art have been written largely without serious consideration of religion. This doesn't mean religion has been absent or irrelevant. Indeed, once one begins looking for it, one finds religious references, concepts, and formations woven throughout these histories. But for various reasons, these became hermeneutically inaccessible in the leading scholarship about art made in the past 170 years or so. And if you're wondering about that umbrella term, modern and contemporary art, you can consider it roughly 1850 to the present is kind of, if I say modern and contemporary art. Contemporary will focus primarily, and the book focuses primarily on the 1970s to the present. And this creates a strange situation. Even as religious traditions have shaped many major 20th and 21st century artists and artworks and the socio-cultural contexts through which they're received and circulated, when one turns to the art historical scholarship about these periods, one finds religion playing little or no constructive role in the writing about these artists and artworks. Of course, this hasn't gone unnoticed by art historians. Several influential scholars have acknowledged it over the years, but have struggled to address it. Most directly, the prominent art historian James Elkins published a short book in 2004 called On the Strange Place of Religion in Contemporary Art. The strangeness he refers to is that religious concerns and conceptualities are actually quite frequently in play in contemporary art, but the methods, theories, and narratives that have structured the grain of the 20th century art history and criticism have rendered this content mostly uninterpretable and irrelevant to what makes contemporary art contemporary. That's Elkins, the gist of his book. He makes that argument in a very ironic way. He wants there to be a more interesting speech, more interesting interpretation, but he's trying to understand why it just is uninterpretable, or has been. Religion might well have a place in contemporary art, but as Elkins summarizes, it does not have a place in talk about contemporary art. And achieving a non-reductive understanding of why that, how and why that's been the case is one of the primary aims of this book. If one spends much time shuttling between artist studios, prominent galleries and museums, art libraries, departments of art history, those sorts of spaces, one soon encounters precisely this strangeness. And I did through my training. To backfill the introduction a little bit, I was originally trained as an artist and was an art professor for 11, 12 years before moving on to what I'm doing now. And so was very much circulated through the LA art world. There are many prominent artists, I've talked to several of them, who have been thinking quite seriously about religion, spirituality, and theology, whether or not they consider themselves to be personally religious, and they are addressing these topics in widely varying ways. But when one moves to the art discourse, the professional writing, talking, and teaching about these same artists, this aspect of their work receives only cursory thinking or simply disappears altogether, as serious thinking gets channeled through more familiar critical patterns. And this isn't simply the fault of scholars. Artists are cagey when it comes to speaking publicly about these topics, especially when they are themselves personally religious or, more commonly, have quite a complicated, conflicted relationship with religion. And an example I put up here from early in my own development was a 2005 exhibition by Tim Hawkinson that I saw in Los Angeles at the LA County Museum of Art, in which there was a giant work called Pentecost, for instance, that consists of all of these bodies based on his own body, each with a different motorized body part, a kneecap, an elbow, a nose, and so on, that hammer on a tree made out of air ducting. And so the whole thing is hollow, so it resonates. And because of the way that it's set up, each of those has a different pitch or timbre, so it's like very high, very low. So it's actually music. It's musical. It's playing. It's hard to recognize, but it's playing Christmas carols. Okay. Who knows what to make of this? Actually, this is a whole nother lecture, what I make of this. But if you turn to the writing about this show and about this work, and there's a lot else from Hawkinson on this topic, the writing never included more than half a sentence description of what the Pentecost reference was. It just was not interesting. It wasn't interpretable. It wasn't intelligible. So something usually along the lines of the apostles after Jesus' ascension, the giving of the Spirit. Sometimes you'd get something like that. A reference to Acts, something like that. This situation's been shifting in recent years, however. Over the past 20 years, there's been, since that Hawkinson exhibition and Elkin's book, there's been a remarkable increase in attention to religion, spirituality, and theology in contemporary art, among artists and scholars alike, evidenced by a number and quality of exhibitions, articles, and books devoted to exploring the pressures these exert in contemporary art. Here's an artist named Jan Vo, again, someone who has quite a conflicted relationship with his own Catholic heritage, Vietnamese-Danish heritage, but it is a prominent topic of his work and stands to be, I think, interpreted substantively, significantly. I won't talk about it for sake of time, but just to throw a few things up in front of you. The African-American artist Arthur Jafa has a relatively recent work called A Kingdom Cometh As, that is an hour and 40 minutes of found video footage, mostly from the Black church. And the thing is a sermon. It's a sermon with big questions in it, but it's a sermon. And here's a clip. The sermon is really structured around this an actual sermon by T.D. Jakes. I have a couple book chapters on this coming out soon. One is out, one is coming. And it's certainly not only Christian content that is very much in play in contemporary art. Hussein Valamanesh is meditating on, he passed away recently, meditating on Sufi theology and his upbringing in Iran, and on and on. There is quite a new visibility of religion in contemporary art. And this renewed attention tends to be dispersed across radically different interpretive priorities and vocabularies, often lacking a sustained interdisciplinary discourse that holds up well both as scholarship of art and as scholarship of religion. And so understanding in a non-reductive way what's happening here is the second primary aim of the book. This book is a study of this situation and an adjustment to it, offering a detailed rethinking of the historical and theoretical context in which current discussions about religion and spirituality in contemporary art are happening, and an argument for why and how these discussions require more concentrated study, both critical and constructive, of the often implicit theologies in play in the history, theory, and criticism of contemporary art. 20th and 21st century art is deeply inwoven with religious contexts, spiritual concerns, theological conceptualities, and so on. But these various threads remain extremely underinterpreted in the scholarship of modern and contemporary art, to the extent that they are often functionally invisible in the scholarship. And this book seeks to understand and revise the way these dynamics of invisibility work. So I want to, in the time we have, offer this is a bit of a fool's errand, but offer a bit of an overview of the book, give you a sense of what's in it. So it might whet your appetite to read it, or to say, I think I know what that book's about. My introductory chapter, which you heard just a little piece of here in pieces, sets up the main issues and arguments, including a lovely meditation, I think, inspired by Walter Benjamin, on how invisibilities might operate in the writing of history. And then the book unfolds in 3 parts, each focusing on a different set of problems related to this topic, and each of those problems probably having a different audience. And that's okay. They link together, and hopefully that will become clear as things move. Part 1 analyzes how and why the scholarship of modern and contemporary art history has, especially through the second half of the 20th century, generally misperceived the manifold ways that its own histories are shaped by religion. Part 2 then turns to examine a new visibility and new discussability of religion in contemporary art, offering several mapping devices to better understand what's going on. Part 3 then shifts the focus from religion to theology. So for those the theologians in the room, don't be too nervous about my use of the word religion. Developing modes of critical writing capable of addressing the theological conceptualities, genealogies, and implications in play in works of art. In arguing that the written histories of 20th century art have significantly underinterpreted the religious context and theological intelligence of modern and contemporary art, I'm not claiming that modernism actually turns out to be a religious cipher or some kind of a crypto-Christian art. Rather, I'm claiming that modernism did not simply leave religion behind or fall theologically mute, nor have the relations between them been simply oppositional or antagonistic. The relations are more complicated and more theologically interesting than that, and they stand to be interpreted as such. That's the premise of the book. So I want to offer glimpses into each of these parts, how they work, and highlight a few insights from each. So part 1. Rather than performing a kind of sweeping survey of the topic, part 1 focuses on 2 clusters of key texts around 2 years, clusters of texts published 25 years apart, 1979 and 2004. They're kind of core samples, so to speak. Artists and artworks are ultimately the crux of the matter here, I think. But these chapters are mainly concerned with the writing about those artists and artworks. In fact, a central argument in part 1 is that the problems surrounding religion exist more in the writing than in the art, and they therefore require some rethinking specifically at kind of historiographical and theoretical levels. There's something keeping us from talking about religion in an intelligent way in art history. That's the concern. My selection of these dates is, to some significant degree, pinned to October, a highly influential journal of art theory and criticism founded in 1976, and really indispensable to the way that art history gets constructed as a discipline in the 80s and 90s. I mean, it didn't get constructed then, but the form that it took, 80s and 90s. The first chapter focuses on an early issue of October, issue 9, and the second chapter engages the massive, widely used textbook Art Since 1900 that was published in 2004 by 4 of the leading editors of October. Chapter 1 conducts a rereading of Rosalind Krauss's influential essay Grids, published in 1979, which exemplifies some of the problems of writing about religion in 20th century art. Essentially what Krauss is trying to do is understand why the grid has been such a formative structure, such a pervasive structure through modern art. Why the grid? And her answer to that is multi-pronged and very interesting, but she says this, among other things. Given the absolute rift that had opened between the sacred and the secular, the modern artist was obviously faced with the necessity to choose between one mode of expression and the other. The curious testimony offered by the grid is that at this juncture he tried to decide for both. Her argument is that the grid in modern art has an irreconcilable, at least double reading. That the grid, one reading is that it is pure materialist art. It is the rectangle of the canvas mapped onto itself, undermining and evacuating all pictorial metaphysics, all representational metaphysics. And that is quite a prominent reading of modern art and the grid in it. However, the grid is also an infinite structure that once it gets thought, there is no end to the grid. It is infinite, and it always suggests an evermore. Thus, also carrying readings within itself of being immaterial, having a connotation of immateriality, of infinity, of timelessness, absoluteness, and so forth. And so the modern artist, according to Krauss, decides for both the sacred and the secular with the structure of the grid, because it allows artists to have a fully materialist secular dialogue in public and transcendent meaning in private. Or for those who know. One of the things she points out is that for Krauss, and you get it in that first line, for Krauss, she says that the materialist reading, there is no other logical way to read the grid other than the materialist reading, in her view. But she says, but the artists have never talked about it that way. When you read the artists, Malevich, Mondrian, so forth, they're talking about being, mind, and spirit, and the absolute. And so her essay is like wrestling with this. One more quote from Krauss. This kind of religion, or the grid and modernist art being a kind of secular form of belief, a way of sustaining religious and spiritual belief in formal terms rather than in symbolic terms, like it's not picturing sacred narratives or something, but it's a formal structure that sustains religious and theological thought. She said this condition could be discussed in the late 19th century, the bargain that was going on, the negotiation. But it is something that is inadmissible in the 20th, so that by now we find it indescribably embarrassing to mention art and spirit in the same sentence. The particular power of the grid, its extraordinarily long life in the specialized space of modern art, arises from its potential to preside over this shame, to mask and to reveal it at one and the same time. And she goes on to say, it allows the contradiction between the sacred and the secular to maintain itself in the unconscious of modernism as something repressed. Okay, you can see why I'm very interested in this essay. It's very helpful because it shows at quite a deep level, but also in the concrete instance and formal structure of the grid, how religion operated invisibly in 20th century art. She's bringing that to the surface, even at the same time that she is suppressing it again, shaming it. And it also helps to clarify how a very strong secularization theory often governed what was admissible, that whole narrative that she starts with, given the absolute rift between the sacred and the secular that opened up in the 19th century. is a secularization theory in which what has happened is a decisive undermining of any basis for shared rational belief, religious belief. And in fact, that secularization theory gets built in deeply to the account of modern art in the second half of the 20th century, partially under the pen of Rosalind Krauss and the October group. I'm going to contest all of that, after retracing Krauss's argument, I'm not going to call it into question here as much as in the book. After retracing Krauss's argument, both sympathetically and critically, it is a sympathetic and critical reading, the perspective widens to perceive significant counterpressures to her argument, both within the art world of the 1970s, that doesn't align with her account, and within larger socio-historical contexts, in which the absolute rift between the sacred and the secular starts to look awfully hackneyed. Or narrow. And secularization theory in general has narrow blinders on what is allowed into the evidence base, so to speak. Chapter 2, and we'll move along at a faster clip here. Chapter 2 leaps forward 25 years to 2004, the year in which Krauss and her colleagues, Hal Foster, Benjamin Buchloh, and Evelyn Bois, published their massive Art Since 1900, a text that powerfully formulates a history of 20th century art in which religion is almost entirely invisible as a relevant context. And that is conspicuous because they're social art historians. They take seemingly every other discipline and corner of culture as being relevant. And this is the same year, of course, that Elkins publishes his On the Strange Place of Religion in Contemporary Art, which I've already mentioned. And it marks, I think, a significant shift in the kind of invisibility. And that invisibility, at least with Elkins and others, becomes conspicuous. So by conducting careful rereadings of these and other texts, in part one, I highlight three main dynamics that have generally kept scholars from recognizing the ways that religious contexts and theological conceptualities operate in the histories of 20th century art. First, Elkins argues that there's a kind of waning of religious themes. I mean, there's a relative absence of religious patronage. Artworks aren't being made for the church or the synagogue or whatever. There's the development of abstraction and all sorts of 20th century art forms, often in reaction to the development of photography, which kind of changes the whole reason for representation and the logic of representation. So you get a lot of non-representational art, and so on, such that religion becomes interpretively ambiguous. Like those grid paintings of Mondrian, they actually have a great deal to do with religion and theology. He talked about them as icons of the immutable. He grew up like Dutch Reformed. He was like very involved in Abraham Kuyper's circle early on, has some sort of crisis of faith, as one does, and starts making these grids in which he's resolving everything into the immutability of the horizon and of the vertical, pure verticality and pure horizontality. They are icons of the immutable that is also concerned with justification. That's another story that I'll have to tell another time. But Mondrian's paintings and others are ambiguous. They leave behind so much of religious iconographies and subject matter and that sort of thing. So they become ambiguous, interpretively ambiguous. This is a factor, but it doesn't really explain very much, because actually critics are really wonderful at reading ambiguities. That's what we do in art history. Ambiguity is lifeblood. So this doesn't really go very far. So there are at least two more that I draw out in chapter 2. I've already mentioned a rigid secularization theory that renders religion interpretively implausible. In many versions, and there are both secularist and religious versions of secularization theory. Religious communities believe in secularization theory as much, if not more, than outside of religious communities. But in many versions, modernism definitionally it just simply is, a highly potent enactment and exemplification of secularization at the fundamental level of visuality itself. This is how a lot of the narrative goes. So that religion is exactly what the history of modern and contemporary art cannot be about. So that when it does show up, it can only be vestigial, ironic, or critical. This is circular reasoning. You define modernism through a particular idea of secularization, and then you read that secularization into the history of modernism. It's circular reasoning, and it doesn't do justice to what actually happened. In various places, the editors of art since 1900 have been quite straightforward about this secularization theory being an agenda, not just a kind of descriptive pursuit. Benjamin Buchloh said in 2001, "The liberation of the work of art from ritual and cult was the key question of the 20th century." For him, that's not a descriptive question, it's a programmatic question. For Evelyn Bois, he says, quote, "The secularization of Western art, despite regular paeans to spirituality from dealers and hack critics, seems to be nearly perfected." Okay. If you have this dominating story of secularization theory, that what it means, what modernity is something that automatically undermines the basis for religious belief, certainly shared religious belief. Once that gets built into the history of modernism, then it just keeps reinforcing itself. Third, a particularly strong hermeneutics of suspicion also was key to the work of October and others. And it tends to render religion interpretively reducible to other explanations. So that when we've got this narrative of secularization that modernism is an exemplification and enactment of, and when religion does show up in major religious artists, their work or their writing or what have you, the critical apparatus that we have for interpreting that work reads all of those manifestations of religion, religious subjects, whatever, in terms of structural power or sublimated desire. And it tends to take all of those apart in a way that reduces them to something else. Once you get, hopefully you can see, even in that brief sketch, once you get an overdetermined secularization theory coordinated with an overactive hermeneutics of suspicion, it's not difficult to see how religious traditions became largely unreadable, uninterpretable in the history of modernism, at least as it gets written, narrated. Even in instances where these traditions were manifestly important, even only in sociological terms, even then they get reducible to power and just vestigial. They're not part of the narrative. They're not part of what makes modern art modern and interesting. Okay, you with me so far? Okay, that's part one, the invisibility of religion. And it is, there are polemics in there, but it was really, I think, quite a slow, sensitive, hospitable reading of the art historians I'm engaging there. It really is an attempt to understand non-reductively why religion became such a problem for modern art historians. Part two, turns. Since 2004, that's a kind of artificial marker, but it's one that makes some sense. There's been a significant surge of interest in religion, spirituality, theology, and contemporary art, partially due to a general unraveling of old secularization theories in the humanities, and a deepening concern or exhaustion or malaise about the kinds of reading and discourse that the hermeneutics of suspicion produce. I should say, the hermeneutics of suspicion do a lot of good. Like, there's a lot of good that comes from them. I'm not against them. But there is a kind of overactive hermeneutics of suspicion that deepening concern, or as I say, exhaustion, has taken hold across the humanities. Also, there's some kind of a secularization theory that's needed. Something has happened, but it's not a narrative of decline of religious belief. That's just not what has happened. It's a pluralization of religious belief. There is more and more different kinds of religious belief. That's what's happening. It's pluralization and disaffiliation from religious identifiers. That seems to have more descriptive potential than a simple narrative of decline, which we're often guilty of telling in seminaries. I just don't think it's right. I don't think it's true. Religion is becoming both more visible and more discussable in contemporary art and beyond contemporary art. You kind of take everything I'm saying here and translate it into other corners of culture that you might know better, perhaps. Numerous prominent artists today are making work directly engaging religious imageries, themes, and points of reference, and they're doing so in quite substantive ways and from a range of perspectives. Just to throw out a couple more, I'm spending a lot of time thinking lately about works by a German artist named Andrea Büttner, whose works are continually kind of working around monastic notions of littleness drawn from Thérèse of Lisieux in the context of spectacle or appalling histories, tragedies. This is Carmel Dachau, about the nuns who live immediately next to the Dachau concentration camp. This is her little sisters, about Carmelite nuns who work in an amusement park. They're very wonderful and interesting. And this isn't a kind of marginal artist. She's one of the Turner Prize nominees. I mean, she's very prominent, very widely known. Genesis Tremaine is an African-American painter who is making portraits that are overtly about her faith. Also not a marginal artist, someone who shows in major museums and so on. And these portraits, they tie into the history of portraiture, but they are about seeing in a way that sees those behind you and those in front of you. It's about ecstatic. It's about an ecstatic experience that she had. There are religious paintings, and she's very overt about it. She even calls herself a devotional painter, which is sort of a naughty word in contemporary art. That should be Saint with Bethel vision, by the way, just to clarify that. And so on. We could go on. And there's numerous exhibitions, articles, books now available on the subject from a wide range of perspectives. Here's some exhibitions. Starting in 2005, just giving you a sampling, coming from all sorts of different points of view. 100 Artists See God. Got Zane, Seeing God. Belief was the first Singapore Biennale. Traces of the Sacred. There's lots of kind of esoteric, occultic interests. There are lots of interests in religion and all sorts of things, the quick and the dead. I mean, it's sort of, there are a lot of these. And there are so many of them, in fact, that I devoted the appendix to of the book to a very long list of exhibitions that are in one way or another about this topic from 1974 to the present. So the book really isn't as big as it looks. It's really, this much of it is like appendix and notes, so it's not so bad. However, this conversation is often confusing and underdeveloped. So part 2 seeks to show the extent of this resurgence and to provide a mapping of it, not to tidy it up or systematize it, but to better understand it with an appropriate degree of complexity, enabling one to orient or reorient oneself in it. Chapter 3 begins this mapping by developing 4 sets of mapping devices. I'm going to not discuss those for sake of time, but they're very interesting. And there's one of the things this does is just opens lots and lots of lines for further research and scholarship. Chapter 4 then examines a large swath of the most important texts and exhibitions that have shaped the scholarship of contemporary art and religion over the last 2 decades. Rather than sorting this material by chronology or method or whatever, this chapter is organized around the 4 hermeneutical horizons developed at the end of chapter 3. And these horizons are important for the argument of the book, so I'll say just a little bit more about them, probably too reductively here, but just to kind of give you some sense of what I'm doing there. Borrowing the term from Gadamer, these horizons are not disciplinary methods or approaches, and I give 4 of them. Rather, I'm trying to identify differing ways in which scholars orient their most basic questions, concerns, and even sense of the world within their studies of art history. I formulated these by just reading heaps of texts and trying to carefully listen to the concerns that scholars are trying to address and what kinds of intelligibility they're trying to produce in their texts when they're writing about art and religion. They're differing they are differing kind of fundamental hermeneutical fields of vision is what I have in mind here, within which a horizon is something that one operates within, not just setting things against a horizon. It's not just about distance, it's about being anywhere. Having a horizon is knowing where you are to some extent, having a sense of things. And it's within a horizon that the relations between art and religion, for instance, show up as salient or intelligible or full of implication. So the aim with these horizons is really to try to drive, in naming them and identifying them, to try to drive the art and religion scholarship deeper into the central questions that it's asking. And there are 4, and I'll identify these quickly. Seen within an anthropological horizon, the questions of art and religion are principally questions of human cultural formation and function. Contemporary art and religion must be studied together, the argument goes, because of what their interrelations tell us about how a particular social world is constituted and sustained. You can't understand contemporary art without understanding its religious context. There's just an anthropological argument to be made there. And some of the main terminologies here, well, I think I took that out, are discussions of material culture, material religion, social identity, social memory, religious imagination, and especially tracing a kind of cultural afterlife of Christianity. That often shows up in this literature. Seen within a political horizon, the question of art and religion are principally questions of the organization and operation of power in a society. Here, the renewed interest in religion may have nothing to do with faith or belief, but with religion's potential to provide critical positions, resources, or focal points for critique and resistance of structural power that operates at the level of visibility. So, one example, a scholar named Donald Preziosi would say, all contemporary art is implicitly dependent on a religious metaphysic to make it work and to make it be presentable. And religion is always relying on artifice, to give it form and exert its power in society. And you have to critique them together in order to undo capitalist visuality. This is Donald Preziosi's argument in a book called Art, Religion, and Amnesia. You kind of get a sense of, there's a political horizon within which all of this is being seen. When studied within a spiritual horizon, the questions of art and religion are principally questions of how to foster socio-eco-spiritual healing, awakening, connectedness, re-enchantment amidst the disconnective and disenchanting conditions of modernity. So political concerns are often incorporated here, but they're often seen as grounded in a deeper spiritual crisis that cannot be addressed through political struggle or critique without a more comprehensive spiritual awakening and transformation. Transformation that the arts are particularly capable of catalyzing. And this tends to take a kind of both post-religious and post-secular form. So it's highly critical of organized religion and orthodoxies and so forth, and is highly critical of materialism and secularism. And so you get a kind of spiritual, not religious sort of form here. And then fourth, lastly, a theological horizon. A growing number of scholars recognize the importance of all these other dimensions. I'm not trying to prize them apart from each other. But also argue that the interrelations of art and religion are not adequately accounted for without recognizing the theological context and the implicit theologies in place throughout these histories. Theologies which, of course, aren't reducible just to institutions or artists' conscious belief. Theology, there are theological artworks work within a theological horizon in much the same way that artworks work within a political horizon or an anthropological horizon. It's not reducible to the artist's intentions. It's not reducible to institutions that do anthropology or do politics. A politics pervades human life. Theology pervades human life. Anytime the question of God is a live question. So you have a wide variety of approaches that are possible here, but common to them is the contention that the questions of God and the manifold histories of talking about God in relation or non-relation to world are still very much part of the discourse of modern and contemporary art. So you might not have any creedal or doctrinal commitments here, you often do, but they're attentive to the ways that art is at some level concerned with theological ontologies, anthropologies, ethics, eschatologies, and more generally, the world's being toward God. So these four horizons are not mutually exclusive, insofar as the complexities of human life are simultaneously social, political, spiritual, theological, and artworks are potentially meaningful in all these ways too. And excellent scholars can keep multiple horizons in view or switch between them perhaps, integrating insights from each. But in practice, scholars usually perhaps must, and not just scholars, artists, anyone, viewers, privilege one as more encompassing, more fundamental to the structure of human life. So these horizons often vie with each other at some level. There's a strong temptation in each of these to reduce all other language to themselves, right? You're familiar with that. And that temptation is alive in the political horizon as much as it's alive in the theological horizon, and so on. So I'm interested in integrating these rather than splitting them off, but I'm also trying to just identify, man, we got different conversations that are happening, and this is one reason why. And I think I meant to do this in a different order. Here's some examples that I'm going to fly by, sorry. Part 3, for sake of time, I'll move to part 3. Part 3 shifts the focus from religion to theology, exploring the need, kind of taking off of that discussion of horizons and surveying how it works, surveying critically and constructively. And exploring the need to develop modes of critical writing capable of addressing theological conceptualities and implications in play and works of art. Of those 4 horizons, the theological is the least developed within art history anyway, or within the discourse of contemporary art, we should say. In doing so, part 3 keeps all these horizons in view, but it homes in especially on the 4th. And the argument here moves forward in 2 ways, both in the form of critical writing and theorizing that kind of writing. So chapter 5 features an extended critical essay about a single artwork. Chris Martin's, Belgian artist Chris Martin, his work Altar, which appears on the cover of the book. And this chapter mulls over the implications of this work, examining how it operates in various contexts and experimenting with how it works within each of the 4 hermeneutical horizons I've identified. So it sort of keeps rolling the work over, shifting its point of view, shifting how it sees, what kind of context it sees the work in. I'll give you a sampling of that chapter here at the end. And in the process, the experiment becomes especially attentive to how a sufficiently thick critical engagement with this artwork demands theological lines of questioning. Chapter 6 then theorizes this kind of writing, art criticism within a theological horizon, by drawing together several threads that have been weaving through preceding chapters. I do problematize religion and the whole vocabulary that I've been working with in the book. So drawing together several threads and thinking more extensively about how theological inquiry might and might not contribute to the scholarship of contemporary art history, theory, and criticism. And this involves thinking from both directions, asking, what is a more agile, historically sensitive understanding of theology? What does it do within art criticism? And what does a more agile, historically sensitive understanding of art history and criticism do within theology? And so the chapter is 2 parts, art criticism and theology, and then theology and art criticism. I'm going to skip that chapter entirely. You can go read that one. It's a good one. It's a barn burner. And last, as a means of advancing the study of religion and theology in contemporary art, the book provides a lot of resources for further study, including heavily researched lists of exhibition catalogs from the last 50 years that address religion, theology, spirituality in various ways. And it's a very diverse kind of list, the way that they're handling those, but it's a list for further research. And then these are also available on my website. In fact, expanded and updated versions of these lists, and there are multiple lists. So jonathan-anderson.com, you can go and find, and they're all there for free. It was important to put it in the archive, I think, print it, but they're also available online for free. So with my remaining time, that gives you a kind of sweep of the book, hopefully a taste of what it's doing, how it works, how it moves. With the remaining time, I want to give just a taste of chapter 5 In many ways, I think extended critical writing about particular artists and artworks is really where the study of contemporary art and religion succeeds or fails. Can it speak intelligently about artworks in a way that opens those artworks rather than closes them down? And if there's going to be a rethinking, an extensive rethinking of the history of 20th century art, for instance, and 21st century art, then it has to be able to show itself in close engagements with artworks. Otherwise, it's a lot of bluster, maybe, or grand theorizing or whatever. So I'm a critic at heart. That's really, that's what I am at heart. Critic, not in the sense of professional art critic that writes exhibition reviews, but someone who's primarily interested in the potential for speech to open what artworks are doing through extended encounter with them. That kind of critical language isn't professionalized. It happens anytime we're standing in front of artworks, summoning speech to account for what they're doing, what they mean. So anyway, the book was supposed to be a series of these extended case studies and with some introductory chapters about the invisibility and new visibility of religion, and those took over the book. And eventually I just let them take over and realized, okay, this is all preface to a larger project, and it's good. The preface needed to be written. But just to give you a sample of what I'm doing here, and then I'll stop talking and we'll take some questions. So if you have some questions, you can formulate those. I'm happy to chat with you. So Altar is a full-scale steel model of the frame of the renowned Ghent altarpiece by Hubert and Jan van Eyck from 1430 or so. The Van Eyck's lush painterly detail and complex iconography span across many large panels. This is a huge polyptych, comprising a dense visual theological meditation on God reconciling all things to himself. I should note, as a side note, I don't have time for side notes, but I'm going to do it anyway. Art history has been extensively detheologized. It's very possible to take quite a few art history courses in Northern European Renaissance art, as I did in graduate school. And for theology basically to operate as a sort of subset of social context. And you can identify who the saints are and so forth, but when you get on to the real business of art history and criticism, we talk about formal advancements, politics, economic context, who the kings are in there, and the Duke, and what was going on politically in Ghent at the time. And you can do the whole thing without any substantive theological discourse about it. That's a real problem. If a big arm of my work is contemporary, modern and contemporary art, the second arm that's been growing over the last few years is a kind of visual theology, rereading the histories of art with greater sensitivity to the ways that they are performing very profound theological reasoning. They're just doing so in the form of visual spatial reasoning rather than verbal written reasoning, and it's often in dialogue with those. Anyway, that's a side note. But doing this chapter really sent me back into the theology of the Ghent altarpiece, and it is a very profound work, I think, and some of that comes through in the chapter. It's about God reconciling all things to himself. By contrast, Martin gives us only a steel version of the vacant frame. He ensures that it is only ever installed in outdoor contexts. It's first installed here in Ostend, Belgium, on the coast of the North Sea. It subsequently was installed in on the High Line in New York City, in quite rural settings, such as the Langen Foundation outside of Dusseldorf, and in sites directly connected to ecclesial spaces, like it was here in London, or Santa Sabina in Rome, or in front of St. Bavo Cathedral in Ghent, where the Ghent altarpiece is. It appeared there in 2020. This multiplicity of environments means that widely varying visions appear through the framework: city and sea, public space and private, economy and ecology, institutions of art and institutions of church. What exactly is Martin showing us? In one sense, he presents a visual historical artifact that's been passed down through 6 centuries, that's replete with social meanings. Martin's not presenting the frame of the altarpiece as much as the framework, the bare architecture of an inherited visual grammar that has long supported a particular way of seeing and understanding the world. Altar is the skeletal structure, we might say, of the altarpiece's visual theological body, constituting the character and range of motion of its conceptual and narrative range of its joints, but without any musculature to articulate those joints, in both senses of the word articulate. The grammatical structure remains, but without any vocabulary. So what is it? Its appropriated form, its title, and often its locations. Altar is in direct dialogue with historical Christianity, but how do we understand the character and implications of this dialogue? I chose this work because it's ambiguous. It elicited experimentation within all of those 4 horizons. And I'll give you just a very brief way that I experiment with this work. Within an anthropological horizon, Altar indirectly puts on display the social worlds that produced, surrounded, and supported the Genter framework for 6 centuries. And those are worlds that have shifted. The empty framework of Altar could be seen as an emblem of a historical emptying of the Christian imagination in Martin's native Belgium. From a situation in which the Eichian vision operated in a more or less consensus Christianity to one in which it represents quite a contested position. The grammatical framework survives, but its content disappeared in the cross pressures of modernity. One could read this work this way to great effect, and I do read it that way to great effect in the chapter. Its framework stands in various public spaces like a steel after-image lingering in the social vision, the social field of vision. Or using Abby Warburg's language, it carries on a visual afterlife, a Nachleben of Flemish Christianity. Either way, it's the after that is key in that reading. Of course, these social worlds and social histories are densely political. Within a political horizon, Martin's presentation of this framework could be seen as an emblem of the powers of framing, of ordering a vision of the world, and thus subtly patterns of knowledge, desire, value, and social relations. The Van Eyck's power to frame history and cosmos, to envision God and eschaton, is a profound power indeed. By emptying the frame, Martin's Altar, in some sense, puts this framing power on display. However, in doing so, it evocatively marks the framing power of the built environment that surrounds it in each environment. As the 15th century framework stands in relations to other frameworks that organize human lives. As one moves around this open window polyptych, its contours align and realign with the brick, steel, and glass grids of nearby buildings. The effect is that the old Genter framework seems to identify these contemporary frameworks as performing religious functions of their own, structuring communal image worlds, implicit eschatologies, and patterns of collective practice, valuation, affection, and so on. I.e., it marks them all out as having some kind of coordinated worship within them, some kind of a life liturgy. These inhabited frameworks of the built environment are coordinating a tacit sense of how the world is, what is trustworthy and hopeful. In this sense, the political implications of Altar are unpredictable. Altar's open wing panels are not only framing, but also facing portion of its surroundings, quietly scrutinizing other nearby frameworks as potentially also altering human lives. And that's beginning to open into a political theology the theological horizon begins coming into view. Within a spiritual horizon, it might be argued that altar focuses a spirituality that's manifestly post-Christian, post-secular, borrowing the altering activity of the old framework, but cutting it free from Christian tradition or institutions, reorienting its grammar of mystical vision, adoration, and hope toward one's immediate environment. Without the Ikean panels, one might argue that its metaphysical and eschatological distances that the Ghent altarpiece is holding open, is collapsed into immanence. Eschatology is exchanged for ecology or economy, depending on where it is. God the Father, Son, and Spirit is exchanged for Mother Nature, Gaia, or the universe, or something like that. But if Martin wanted a spirituality cut free from religion, it seems counterproductive to borrow such a particularly recognizable and densely theological framework. Even in its empty state, the Ikean structure is too hermeneutically loaded to generically signify spirituality, or a spirituality open to the present, or a religion abandoned to the past. It's too specific, it's too loaded. No matter how much one empties this particular frame, it never really detaches from its obvious source and the theological substrate of that source. So what might we say about that? Within a theological horizon, the emptiness of the frame may have less to do with conceptual vacancy or social desuetude than with visual silence. I'm sorry for using the word desuetude. Social erosion, how about that? Invalidation, I don't know. The polyptical time frame of the Ghent altarpiece is fundamentally about ontological relations between heaven and earth, and temporal relations between source and fulfillment, beginnings and ends. The fact that the frame is presented without any imagery with which to think these relations doesn't eliminate or de-theologize these relations, but de-visualizes them. And across its various traditions, Christian theology has always thought profoundly about emptiness, silence, and refusal in theological representation, such that critical engagements with Martin's work may function quite substantively within Christian theology rather than simplistically opposing it. In fact, like, why interpret this work, the vacancy of the frame, through the heritages of Durkheim and Marx and Nietzsche, without also doing so through the heritages of Gregory of Nyssa, Dionysius the Areopagite, Nicholas of Cusa, or for that matter, Calvin, Kierkegaard, Barth. The work generates a kind of apophatic retracing of Christian eschatology toward what no eye has seen, nor ear has heard, and no heart has imagined, as 1 Corinthians says. So one could pursue that direction. By situating, but there are others, which I'll end with. I'm ending, I really am. By situating altar in these various places, Martin causes the Ghenter time frame, the time space, to stand in those places where it continues to murmur about the reconciliation of all things. More than murmur, the openness of the framework prompts us to see through it. Martin has turned the Ghenter altarpiece into a polyptical aperture, perhaps, through which one sees a particular expanse of sky, earth, plants, buildings, passers-by, this world unfolding through time. When the Ikean imagery disappears from the framework, the rest of the world shows up through it. Seen through the theologically charged silence of the Ghenter aperture, if that's what it is, all such details and all possible relations between them appear within the grammar, if this is the surviving grammar, the grammar of divine economy, as somehow within the province of the Lamb, which is what the painting is about, the altarpiece is about. This aperture logic is already, it receives some further kind of reinforcement, this reading, because that's already formulated in the Ghent altarpiece itself. The thing is an elaborate windowing structure in which one sees through the incarnation into Ghent, 15th century Ghent. I mean, the outside of the altarpiece is literally looking through the space of the Annunciation into Ghent. But then it opens into the eschatological future through the incarnation, through the doors of the altarpiece into the Lamb enthroned. Within the visual theology of the altarpiece, the incarnation itself is the frame into which all times are gathered, enfolded, and opened, and through which this world becomes perceivable. Even in its barest form, it is precisely this windowing that remains fundamental to what altar is doing. Martin doesn't want to interpret this work for us. The few things he does say is that he wants it to be a window. He wanted to see through the Ghent altarpiece. And that's about all he'll say. I'm ending. The vision available through Martin's steel framework is one of chronological duress, ever-fleeting visions of the beauty and futility of all things under the sun. Time has always been passing in front of Der Ghenter altar, but the emptiness of altar and its displacements into multiple outdoor locations makes this more conspicuous, as it constantly shows a moving image of the world, or shows some portion of the world as an image. Indeed, one of the strangest aspects of seeing this work and seeing through this polyptical aperture is that it momentarily flattens the spaces seen through its cells, causing the world to appear as a surface within the frame, a surface that moves and a surface that unfolds and enfolds, a surface that might be rolled up like a scroll. This experience of perceived flatness does not render the world unreal, but renders it as delicate, limited, contingent, fleeting. Nor does this perceived flatness place the viewer in a position detached from the surface. Rather, the surface seen through the open window of the Ghenter frame is the surface of all things, constituting and comprising all that exists, including the being here of the viewer. One finds oneself in the surface of the world, part of the surface of the world. Altar shows the intricate, replete, shining surface of the world as the surface to which all creatureliness belongs, the surface where all things finally come to pass, in fact. I'll end there for real. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer some questions. I think we got about 15 minutes or so for questions. Okay, thanks. So there are some microphones in the back. If you have any questions, I'm happy to field those. And they can be of any sort. That was a rather overheated lecture, wasn't it? That's okay. It's a big book, you know. Ron.
My turn. Hi. You mentioned that this study of this piece, you had intended to do more of them, but focused on this one because the other things kind of took precedence. Are you looking at doing another book that will have more of these, I don't know, case studies or?
Yeah, it's in the works. It's still.
What are some of the works that you?
Well, I'm hesitant to say because I've got several going, but I haven't quite. Because of the length at which I write these things, like they'll end up being, kind of long chapters. They're not very short. Then there's an issue of balance, balancing it out, So I've got a few different going and see how they talk to each other. A couple just to throw out to be not too withholding. This case study, because I could only do one in the book, it became clear. I didn't want to choose an artist who already has a huge canonical kind of corpus to them, because it would be so specific to one part of the kind of canon, and there would be so much kind of, in some cases, revisionist work to be done. So I wanted to choose someone who has a lot of international stature, someone who I think is a fantastic artist, and who was very gracious as a conversation partner. But someone for whom the writing wasn't developed to a great extent, so it could be more openly experimental, and an artist whose work was clearly in dialogue with Christianity, but was quite ambiguously in dialogue. It was ambiguous about how to interpret it. So that was the reason for this. With the forthcoming work, so I'm interested in some of those like really canonical artists. I would really like to do a rereading of Saul LeWitt, who is kind of one of the key figures in the development of conceptual art in the 60s, 70s, who had a whole lot more to do with Jewish mysticism than has been understood, I think. I've done quite a bit of work on Andy Warhol. That may come up again here. So there are several like really major kind of canonical artists I'm interested in rewriting. But I'm also really interested in artists working today. So I'm doing a lot of writing on Andrea Buttner, for instance. I'd love to write about Doris Salcedo. I don't know. These are some, and these are, the artists I'm writing about have conflicted relations with religion. It's not to, like, in saying Doris Salcedo, that isn't to, like, what I'm not trying to do is sort of claim her as a Catholic again, or a Christian. It's not about finding a label for her. It's about engaging the depth at which her work is in dialogue with theology. It is about life and death and the importance of remembrance in her case that is extraordinarily theological. Okay, those are some examples. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's good.
We'll go to this side.
Congratulations, Jonathan, on this major achievement, and thank you for your talk tonight. Very eloquent treatment of altar in particular, but it's a very exciting project. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the place of the exhibitions and the curators in your arguments. So you have this massive appendix that spans from the mid-70s to close to the present, and you're continuing to update it. You mentioned earlier the journal and the textbook, right, which kind of set up this invisibility piece, but it seems like the galleries and the curators are being quite active, and the catalogs you show. Is there a real articulateness about religion in those catalogs, in those exhibits? How do the gallery spaces figure into your argument? Because I've heard you speak about the artists and then about the critics. Yeah,
that's an excellent question, very perceptive question. Thank you for that. So I became increasingly interested in the exhibitions, and it ballooned into this very huge project, actually, of just, there were very few places where you could find these, so I just had read through so many of them that I just started like, okay, someone needs to have this in all one place, so here. And it became so interesting to me because with the exhibitions, you had the issue of visibility and undiscussability or discussability present in the same place. So on the one hand, you had a lot of those exhibitions were kind of making visible a lot of artists and a lot of content that really was carrying on quite an extended dialogue with religion, spirituality, theology, however, of whatever form. But the writing was consistently disappointing. So you get a kind of big title, like one example is The Problem of God, which was a big exhibition in Dusseldorf at the big contemporary art gallery there, art museum, rather. And that exhibition was, as an example, was originally proposed by the Council of Bishops, who were having their 50th anniversary meeting in Dusseldorf that year. And so they proposed to the gallery, what if we did like a religion in contemporary art show, or the cross or something, I don't know. And the museum said, no, but it's an interesting idea. So we're not going to do it with you, but maybe we'll do our own thing. And so the curator of that exhibition, the premise of it, I had a good talk with her. She said, I'm not a religious person, but I kept visiting. My whole job is to go from studio to studio and talk to artists about what they're working on, like exciting artists. And studio after studio that I was going into, I was encountering religious imagery, and we were having religious conversations. And I didn't really know what to make of that or how to talk about it. So this show is The Problem of God, which is a kind of problem, how to speak about it, and how to visualize it, how to think God after the death of God is the way that it kind of got framed. The writing in that catalog is interesting, but it operates entirely within the anthropological and political horizons. So the problem of God that's the title of the exhibition, but the way that it gets framed in the writing is all about the cultural afterlife of Christianity. No one believes it anymore is kind of how it was framed, but it's still banging around in our cultural imaginations, and artists are using it. What sense do we make of that? How do we make sense of the afterlife? And she specifically uses the Nachleben afterlife language. But the works themselves kind of betrayed that framing in many ways. No, the problem of God was actually a theological problem, so much in the work that it doesn't come through so much in the writing, if at all. In fact, one of the texts is quite anti-theological, or adamantly non-theological. And so that I kept seeing that dynamic over and over again, and so the exhibitions became a really evocative site for exploring visibility, invisibility, discussability, undiscussability. Is that? Yeah. Yep, good. Up here.
Well, thank you. That was a treat. I have two questions. You can choose which one to focus on, depending on time. First is a practical one. Where in this chronology do Image Journal and the work of Makoto Fujimura fit in? Curious about that, since we're close to a lot of those here at Regent. Yeah. And then the second one is just an invitation to spin off on something that you hinted at, which is how does this interact with the rest of culture? And I wonder, as you've been working on this book, what other cultural aspects were fitting right into this?
Yes, good. Thank you for both of those questions. Let's see. The first question is, there are a few different ways of answering it, I think. So Image Journal, Mako Fujimura, I think Image was founded about 30 years ago. I think that's right, so mid-90s, late 90s. And there does seem to be, there are all sorts of other factors that go into like new publications coming online and that kind of thing. But one of the explanations is that that just is there were a lot of kind of projects similar to Image Journal that were sort of launched late 90s, early 2000s, that kind of thing, that are developing kind of different forms of speech around the arts, I think. or redeveloping them, or developing them some more, or providing venues for that, I suppose. And image was always, it's never really been like a contemporary, it's very contemporary. It's never really contributed to the art academy directly, and at least not in visual art, more so in poetry and literature and that kind of thing. But it has been a really fruitful place for publication and discussion and that kind of thing. Mako and Bruce Herman, and there's a kind of generation of artists that emerged around the same time, 90s, I think. And one way to narrate that is to say that there was an organization called Christians in the Visual Arts that was founded in the late 70s, actually right around the time that Krauss was pronouncing what they were doing embarrassing. And the formation of Christians in the Visual Arts was very much artists who were in MFA programs or just out of them, who very much felt that embarrassment, the force of that embarrassment, and were finding each other. I mean, that's really how those early SIVA conferences came about. And so there was a time of kind of permission giving, mutual permission giving, that marked some of those circles, SIVA and other kind of Christian organizations in the arts, at least in North America. And that, the kind of second generation, I suppose, of that includes artists like Mako and Herman and others who were, I think, finding their voice in a more robust way as artists. Is that okay? And I suppose you have a generation after them that are kind of wanting to stay even more squarely in the kind of art world, art academy, those kind of things. And yeah, so there's an interesting genealogy to be told there. That also coincides with the emergence of a lot of the theology and the arts programs. There aren't very many chairs in theology and the arts. I'm very happy to occupy one. But all of them were established in the late 90s to the present. They're only that old, all the ones that I'm familiar with. Actually, those chairs, I think those weren't, like, Jeremy Begbie started doing all his stuff in the 90s, but it was as a theology professor. In fact, at Duke, he's still doing it as a theology professor, a theology chair. And there are the chairs in theology and the arts that have emerged in the last 20 years or so. Okay, is that okay? There's really interesting stories to be told there. Yeah. We'll go over here and then come back. Yeah.
I'm wondering if I can ask you a personal question rather than intellectual per se. It's regarding the book, I promise.
Yeah,
okay?
certainly, yeah, do.
So how has the research you conducted for this book formed or enhanced your own worldview and your relationship with God?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll say it this way. It has in so many different ways. And maybe I'm realizing I didn't answer Daniel's second question, which is an important one. So maybe I'll tie these two together. One of the ways that it has really influenced me is that it has really enlarged in me a sense of, this is a nerdy term, but discursive hospitality. Like, I'm really interested in listening and talking to almost anyone, and talking about religion in spirituality and theology and all these things in a way that is really interested in hearing. Because I think it's fundamentally at the core of the book, if I can say this on record, whatever, at the center of the book and the whole project isn't just making theological arguments. It is about love of neighbor. I mean, I come out of the art world. Like that's my community in so many ways. I love that community. Communities. There are lots of communities, and there are lots of fairly unlovable people. But I love them. Love that world. Love the arts. I mean, I'm a lover of modern art and contemporary art and contemporary artists. And even contemporary scholars, even them. No, I do love them. And so there is in all of this a kind of a growing sense of love for others that takes the form of dialogue about, and then ultimately that is rooted in a deepening sense of God's love for the world. I mean, one of my objections to the strong secularization theory is a theological objection. And I'll leave it at that. I just don't think that God lets go of people. Certainly not in any kind of like grand decline narrative sort of way. I don't. So that's some personal answer to Daniel's question, because it's related. The secularization theory stuff, I really spent a lot of time in sociology and philosophy in the book, and really spent a lot of time with secularization theory and how it works and the way that it gets constructed and falls apart and some of those things, and in like the critical theories that we could call hermeneutics of suspicion. But those aren't exclusive. Like the dynamics I'm describing here aren't exclusive to the academic art world. They are very much visible in literature, in all sorts of zones of culture, and so hopefully that kind of gives you some. It really is a lot of these dynamics of visibility and invisibility are happening in other domains in different ways. It's just visibility is so specific to the visual arts. Okay, we'll do one more question and then we'll end and go from there. Yeah.
Yeah, Jonathan, Dave Larson. I'm hoping that this book is going to be like an explosion in the art world, because I just some of those dynamics that you were speaking about at the end there, you're articulating the shift between modernity and post-modernity. And I see certainly from my perspective in Southern Africa, I see post-modernity as the embarrassed reaction of the children of the moderns, who are embarrassed about the rape of the environment, the colonization of the world, and all of that. And actually, the narratives of the ideologies of modernity they're reacting against. And I feel like you are doing this so well to trace that happening in the art world. And I hope that this just explodes in the art world globally, and people are waking up to, wow, this is really what's happening, and we actually need to catch up with the reality. As art critics, we've got to kind of catch up again. Is that how you see it, or am I?
Well, I do hope the book is well received. hopefully it's not quite as violent as explosions, but yeah. So yes, yeah. With regard, like you're asking, do I see the catching up thing? Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, part of this book, and this gets back to the personal question also, actually. Part of this book grew out of personal experience. Like I did sort of feel the embarrassment that Krauss was talking about when I was an MFA student. In the early 2000s, before, like up and right when Elkins wrote his book. So I felt that, but I also felt so much else going on. Like part of this book comes out of so many conversations with artists in their studios that were misaligned with the writing about those artists' work. That there really was this, Elkins calls it an open secret, the amount of religious interest and concern and formation. Like every other artist I know was raised in some kind of a devout household, has a conflicted relationship with that, but is deeply formed by it and haunted by it and can't sort of, I mean, so much of that is going on that and so much of the culture has changed since I was an MFA student in the early 2000s. I mean, so much has changed around the topic of religion. So in some ways, yes, I hope this is really closely read. So far, seems to be being closely read, and I hope it does kind of encourage a sort of catching up. But I mean, the catching up is partially. I'm okay with it taking a little while, because it is about developing a sort of culture, a kind of language, a kind of discussion that has strength and weight to it, you know? Like it took, like the major critical methods that I learned in graduate school, like the art critical methods, they aren't that old, really. I mean, a lot of them really came online in the 70s, late 70s. I mean, some of them were being formulated in the early 20th century, but the way that those critical models worked, it was the 70s, and it took them a while to like really read enough Marxist theory and enough psychoanalytic theory and whatever for art historians to read enough of that what they were writing held up well in both as art history and as like critical theory, political theory, whatever. And so it has taken and it will take a little while for enough art historians or art critics or whatever I am and other people who work on this to read enough good theology and understand it well enough that it holds up well as religious studies, as theology, and as art history. That's hard to do for any person, but it is achievable over time in community where you develop a kind of discourse, a kind of a way of speaking, a way of studying, that kind of thing. So there is a catching up effect, but I'm somewhat okay with the time lag, if that makes sense. Thank you for that very lovely comment, and thank you very much for bearing with me through all of this, and for coming tonight. I appreciate it. And if you like, there's a book stand in the library or in the bookstore just out there. If you like, I'll sign a book for you or chat. So thanks very much for coming. See you soon.